Now in this module, I'm going to talk about timelines for completing your due diligence. And I'm going to start with talking about the overall note buying flow. Now I know this is a little bit of an eye chart, and it doesn't even really encompass the entire note investing process. This is just talking about from when we get a tape to when we actually close the deal. And these boxes in yellow are the ones that we're actually covering on in this course for our due diligence. But I kind of want to explain this overall note buying flow so you can see where these steps fit into the process and the timeline. So the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to get a tape from an asset manager. Then we're going to do our pre-bid due diligence. So we're going to filter the tape. We're going to figure out which of the assets on that tape fit our strategy and seem to be good assets and ones that we're going to want to put bids in on. Okay. So then at that point, you decide what you're going to bid on or not. If you're not going to bid, and this is just kind of a side note to this module, but somebody sends you tape and you're not going to bid it at all because it doesn't fit, go ahead and drop a note to the seller. Give them some feedback. It goes a long way to creating good relationships with sellers. It lets them know that you're reviewing the assets that you're sending them to, and they're not just getting thrown over a transom into a black hole. It also helps train and kind of educate asset managers to send you things that you're interested in bidding on. So for example, say you get this tape, all the assets are vacant, you're looking for owner occupied, you come back to the seller and say, hey, I'm sorry, I'm not going to bid these because I see these are all vacant. I'm really looking for owner occupied assets that are in the southeast US, right? And then next time around, yeah, that asset manager can send you something that's more in your wheelhouse. Okay, but for the ones you are going to bid, you're going to prepare and submit those bids. So again, we're not talking about pricing and ROI calculations in this course. And then this is a little bit simplified, but I'm assuming for the sake of this chart that either the bid's accepted or not. Now, in reality, bids are often countered. I've had notes that I bought where I bid, there was a counter, I recountered, and the seller recountered after that. So sometimes that process can be a little bit of a circle. But if it was not accepted, this is another little area that can help you that most note investors don't do. If your bid's not accepted, set a reminder in your CRM to re-pursue the deal later. I've bought several notes where originally my bids either weren't accepted or the seller said, I already accepted a bid from someone else. A lot of times what happens is note deals fall through all the time, either because the buyer flakes out or the buyer, sometimes they find legitimate problems, but sometimes, they just get scared for various reasons. So if you follow up with the asset manager in a couple weeks, say, hey, did those assets sell? What's going on with this? Sometimes you can end up buying them after the fact. It's something that I learned when I worked for Harris Corporation, a defense contractor. They were really good at this. When they lost a big contract, they would stay close with the customer, stay in communication, and more than once, the contractor who won the bid initially screwed up, didn't do things right, and then by continuing to pursue, Harris would sometimes win that job back eventually. So just because you don't win a deal doesn't mean you're never going to get it. Probably 99% of note investors don't realize that. So it's very important. So set reminders to follow up with the seller. So assuming your bid is accepted, now we're going to do the post-bid due diligence phase of the process. That's really the meat of this course. And then, of course, you're going to find out through that process if you're okay to close or not. If you're not, you might be canceling the bid. In some cases, you might be fading the bid, meaning you're going to basically lower your price that you're offering, which I don't do that often, but sometimes that happens. And then you're also going to want to communicate with the seller. Hey, I found out that this property was listed as owner occupied. I found out it was vacant, and the property's trashed, so I need to cancel this bid. But assuming everything is good to go, then you will close the deal. So now I'm going to talk about some of the timelines and how long it takes for these two steps in the process, our pre-bid due diligence and then our post-bid due diligence. Okay, so pre-bid due diligence first. So there's no fixed timeline on this generally. Now some brokers like Dave Polio will give you 7 days. They'll send notes out to their list and say all the bids are due within 7 days. So sometimes there is a fixed timeline. More often than not, you're talking to an asset manager, they send you a tape, and it's kind of open-ended how long you have to get back to them. However, getting back to them with bids sooner is always better. I mean, if you're faster or if you're too slow, someone may make a bid that gets accepted before you. The seller may decide to do something else with the asset. Um, and then some brokers like John Keith will actually do like a first come, first serve thing where I believe they have reserve pricing from the sellers and they just take the first bid that's over the hurdle, which is not an ideal way. I don't think it's not the way I would do it, but some people do that. So it behooves you to get through your pre-bid due diligence and then actually put your bids together and get them in as soon as possible. And remember our goal, right, is not just to get them in fast, although it is to get them in fast, it's also to obviously be accurate. But being accurate doesn't just mean filtering out every single asset and then not turning in any bids. We also want to make sure we don't overlook any good assets. I think one of the big mistakes a lot of people make is they are overly restrictive in their filters. They filter out too many assets and it causes them to not make enough offers. One of the biggest things that people do is just most known investors do not turn in enough offers because the reality is most offers don't get accepted. I think I've been running at between 10 and 20% getting offered. And that's even in cases where, I mean, a lot of times I have relationships with these sellers and I'm able to oftentimes just not submit bids in cases where I know they're not going to get accepted. So we don't want to be overly restrictive. We want to make sure we're capturing all the good stuff that's in the tapes. But we don't want to just throw in bids willy-nilly on everything and then have to come back later and cancel them because you put in a bunch of bids on crappy assets. So there's a dichotomy here, right? There's a balance that we're always trying to run. And there are three main steps in the pre-bid process. So the first one's our initial filtering, which we've already talked a little bit about the set of initial filters. We're going to do our automated data collection. And so that's when we're going to use our spreadsheet to pull in Zillow data if it's a large tape, or maybe pull in some Google data. Then we're going to pull in the manual data that we can't do through our other spreadsheets. That might be looking up Trulia crime data or some other data online. And this, as far as timeline, this can take anywhere from a couple minutes if it's a small tape, but really should take no more than a couple hours, even if it's a really big tape. And I'll go through an example later in the course where I filter through a relatively large tape for you. Try to go top to bottom. Okay. So what we want to do is have strong filters, know what we're looking for, have our strategy in place, and be able to get through this pre-bid process pretty fast to know which assets we want to place bids on. Now the post-bid due diligence. This is really the meat of the course, and it's the most important part because in the pre-bid, I mean, when you make a bid, it's an indicative offer, right? You're not obligated to close on the asset at that point. When we get to the post-bid, that's where we're really deciding whether or not we're going to close or not. And so it's, kind of do or die time. And that's where we really want to make sure we're not overlooking something. Typically, this process takes about 2 weeks for me. It can take longer, it can go faster, but generally, and mileage varies depending on how long it takes you to get BPOs and O&Es and things like that. But generally, it's in about the 2-week time frame, and that's a very reasonable time frame to ask sellers to give you. If sellers start asking for super fast closing timelines, that's a big red flag. I've had sellers ask if I could close in like 3 days, which you can't do your due diligence in that amount of time. If some seller asks for something really fast, it could be that it's about to go to tax sale. It could be that they don't really own the asset and it's a scam. There are scammers out there. So watch out for that. Now, there are cases where, reputable sellers will sometimes ask for less than 2 weeks. If they ask for 1 week, that can be okay under certain conditions. If it's a seller that you've worked with before, that you trust, that can be all right. And if the seller has a good reason, right? So I've bought assets that were, where the seller was closing out a fund. They wanted to get it closed by a certain timeline. I also have bought stuff at the end of the calendar year where the sellers come and said, hey, we need to close this out by the end of the calendar year. There's only a week left. I'm just sending this to you because I know it fits what you're looking for, and I know that you'll close if you say you're going to. And in those cases, I can go fast. But those are kind of special circumstances. Be very leery of anybody who's pushing you to close super fast because it could mean that something is wrong. Now, if you're getting into larger trades, you start trading, 10 plus notes, or you're buying larger pools for a fund or something like that, or if you're dealing with banks, then usually 30 days is kind of a good timeline because it just takes longer to get through everything. Making your phone calls, going through everything else, reviewing all the collateral can take a lot of time if you're going through a bunch of them. So it's all a little bit relative, but if you're buying 1 to 6 notes or so, that this 2 week timeline is about what you should be shooting for. And then, just a side note here, if the seller asks you for a time frame, let's say a seller says, hey, I'd like to close in 2 weeks, you say great, and then it takes you 4 weeks, they're probably going to hang in there with you and close it. They're probably not going to sell it out from under you. However, if you don't do what you say you're going to do, you are going to damage the relationship with the asset manager, and that's going to make it more challenging for you on future trades. They're not going to want to work with you as much. I had an example a while back where the seller took 8 weeks to close. They just drug on and drug on and drug on, and they had this issue and that issue, and they came to me in week 6 with some problem that they could have found on day 1 or could have told me about on day 1. And that's just ridiculous. And I completed the trades with them. I hung in there, but next time that buyer sends in bids, it better be one hell of a bid for me to accept it and want to deal with their BS. So, don't panic if they say 2 weeks and it's going to take you, 2 weeks and 1 day, but do what you need to do to hit your timelines and don't just let things drag. The other thing I'll say too is when you get a bid accepted, start the post-bid due diligence process right away. The other thing I see people do is they wait. I've accepted bids from people and then I ping them 5 days later. Say, hey, how's it going? They go, oh, I haven't started yet. So what the hell are you doing? That this 2 weeks assumes you're actually doing work throughout those 2 weeks. And it's amazing how time can pass by quickly, right? Because normally when you're doing due diligence on a loan, that's not the only thing you're doing. You probably have a day job, you're doing other projects, you got other real estate things going on, you got other things happening in your portfolio. So we need to keep these things moving. If you let them sit, time can zip by very quickly. Okay, so what are the actual steps in the post-bid due diligence process? And I'll go through the steps and then I'll talk about our options for sequencing and the overall timeline and how that maps. And I'm also going to differentiate between steps that don't cost money and ones that do, because one of the big things that happens is we find fatal problems with assets where we can't close, but we've already now spent money on due diligence, and that's just a loss. It's part of the price of doing business as a note investor. But we also want to take steps as we put together our systems to try to minimize those expenses. So really the first step is we're going to get the soft collateral from the seller. Okay, and really this post-bid timeline doesn't really start until the seller sends you the soft collateral. If they don't send you the soft collateral right away, that's a red flag. Ideally, once they accept the bid, they should send that to you like right away, same day, maybe the next day, but pretty fast. And that's really when the clock starts. We're going to have to order our BPOs. Typically, this takes 3 to 7 days, kind of depends what city it's in. If you're in a major metro area, you can get it a little faster. If you're in a more minor city, it may take a little longer. If you're rural, it could take a really long time sometimes. And obviously, getting a BPO is typically going to cost money. And then you're also going to have to order your O&E report and get that back. Typically, if you're ordering through ProTitle, which is who I use, their SLA is 3 business days. They do have an option where you can spend a little more money and do a 4-hour expedite. That's not available in all counties, though. Some counties you'll find are a little bit behind in their technology and how they do things. And so the title companies have some more manual processes. So the 4-hour expedite is not always available, but in some places it is. You can use if you're in a pinch. And obviously those cost money. Then you're going to make your phone calls to your realtors, code enforcement utilities. That could take maybe a couple minutes. If you're just dealing with like one asset and you get through right away on the phone, may not take that long at all. Obviously, if you're doing multiple assets, it's going to take longer. And if you end up on hold for a long time, which is common, could drag out for a few hours, particularly calling utilities. I seem to always end up on hold for quite a while. And then your attorney doc review. If you're using folks like Joel Markovitz or Franco Barilli, it's usually 1 to 2 days. If you're using another attorney, especially one that's not used to doing doc reviews, could take longer. It all depends. And obviously that costs money as well. So our goals in this, before we put together the timeline, I want to research like what it is we're trying to accomplish. So we want to make sure that our assets are clean. In other words, the chain of title is clear. If I buy this note, I can resell this asset to someone else and they're going to close on it because the chain is clear. We want to make sure that the note is enforceable. In other words, if I need to go through a foreclosure, I can do that. Or if I resell the note and that note buyer needs to go through a foreclosure, they can do that as well. And then we want to make sure that we're buying quality assets that are going to deliver the returns that we expect. So in other words, we want to make sure that our BPO values are good. We want to make sure that the servicing and pay history is good and the note's going to perform the way that we're kind of expecting. We want to make sure there's nothing weird in the servicing notes that indicates that maybe this loan is going to turn bad soon. I've seen things in servicing notes like the borrower called in, said they lost their job, and maybe they've been paying right up until then. Right now someone's selling it to you. So we want to make sure that everything we were expecting and anticipating in our pre-bid phase is going to hold relatively true. And then a secondary goal, which is very important that I've already touched on, is we want to minimize our spend, how much money we spend on assets that we end up not closing. This is a big cost of business and note investing. And each of the last couple of years, I looked in QuickBooks, it was a couple $1,000s each year just on due diligence on notes where I had bids accepted, but I was unable to close because I found fatal flaws that prevented me from doing that. I have one friend who the year before last said he spent like $7,000 or $8,000 on due diligence on notes that he couldn't close. So we want to try to minimize. It's a fact of life. You're not going to eliminate it, but we can do some things to try to minimize it. So one of the things we can do is do the processes first that don't require spending money. So when you get the soft collateral, do a review yourself. Now at first, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge, right? You'll be leaning more heavily on your attorneys at first, but as you do more of these, you'll get to the point where you can spot a lot of title issues on your own up front. And then you can also make the phone calls up front before you start spending money. You start making phone calls and find out that your asset that's supposed to be owner occupied has, and the water was shut off 8 months ago and the power's off. You kind of know at that point something's wrong. You can go back and talk to the seller. You don't need to start spending a lot of money on BPOs and O&Es. And then start with when you do start spending money, start with the process that's most likely to reveal a fatal flaw. And this can vary whether it's the O&E report or the BPO. If it's a higher end neighborhood and the Google Maps photo is only a couple months old and the property looks really good, and there's a lot of equity in the deal, the BPO value is probably going to come in just fine. So in that case, I might order the O&E report first, since there's more likely that if there's a problem, it's going to reveal itself in the title report. Likewise, if it's a lower end asset and I've already done the soft collateral review myself and I'm pretty familiar with doing them, and I think the chain of title looks clear, and it's more likely that the BPO value is low or there's some problem, the flaw with the property, then I might pull the BPO first. And you also have to know your seller, right? So if it's a seller you've worked with before, you'll find that different sellers have different quality of assets. Some sellers have very clean assets. They do their own due diligence very well. They keep very good records. They keep their taxes paid. Um, if it's one of those sellers, I won't bother with trying to rejigger my process to save money. I'll just order the BPO and the O&E as soon as I get the bid accepted and just fire and just do everything at once. However, there are some sellers who are known for having a lot of crappy assets. And in those cases, I just do everything in series. So folks like Window Rock Home Opportunity, they're known for having a lot of terrible title flaws. They're known for listing properties as owner occupied when they're vacant. And with sellers like that, I do everything in series. Now, why would I even deal with a seller like that? Well, the answer is I've gotten a lot of really good deals from them. You find some really great gems. So it's annoying because I waste a lot of time and a lot of money on due diligence on stuff that I can't close, but I also find a lot of good deals. So I kind of put up with it. But my process with them is a little different than the process with the high quality sellers. Now, for a sort of normal process, takes about 2 weeks. So assuming I'm going to do everything in series, I can do my soft collateral review myself, make phone calls. It only takes about a day, not that long. Assuming if it's one asset. Now, if you're doing a bunch of assets, that's going to take more time. And then whether I order the BPO or the O&E, the order I do this doesn't really matter, as I just discussed. Which one I do first will depend kind of on the asset. Usually about 3 to 7 days for the BPO, about 1 to 3 business days for the O&E. So you also might want to time out too around weekends. Think about when you order your O&E report so that those weekends aren't lost days in the timeline. And then I'm going to at least need the O&E report back before I can do the attorney review. I can do the attorney review without the BPO, but I need the O&E before I do the attorney review. That's about 1 to 3 days. And then once I do get through all of this, I want to come back and do a final check. Even if everything is checked out along the process, I just want to kind of come back, run through everything again, make sure I didn't miss anything along the way. And so leave a day for that. So, there's some give or take in each of these steps, but usually this maps out to about 2 weeks overall. If I'm going to accelerate the process or it's a seller that I trust, I'm just going to order the BPO and the O&E right away. I can start on my soft collateral review and phone calls. Still need to wait for the O&E to do their attorney review. And this I can end up doing in about a week typically. And it's really going to depend on the BPO, right? Which is normally 3 to 7 days. If the BPO's at the 7-day mark, well, then this process is going to take a little bit longer. But if I do end up getting a BPO back in 2-3 days, then it goes faster. You also have the option typically of ordering expedited BPOs if you're trying to go really fast. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up what we talked about here, get your process started right after your bid's accepted. Don't dilly-dally and screw around because time can get away from you a lot faster than you think. If there is an issue, if you do find a problem, let the seller know right away. Don't wait for the seller to contact you. Let them know what's going on. Give them the evidence. If you got a bad BPO or problem on the O&E report, send them the report. Let them know. Start talking to them. See if there's something you can work out. A lot of times I've had sellers resolve title issues. Sometimes you can adjust pricing if it makes sense in that case, but talk to the seller. And then if it is a seller that normally, if it's what I call a high quality seller, then you can go ahead and do these things in parallel. But typically, if it's someone that I've had problem assets with before or somebody that's new to me that I don't know, then I'm going to do all these things in series. And they're just going to have to deal with the 2-week timeline. Okay? Thanks.